Hello, my name's Jade and today I'm going to be going through the books that I read in November. I read 12 books in November and they were very varied. I read 2 poetry collections, 2 non-fiction books, 3 novels, 1 novella, 1 short story collection and 3 graphic novels. And they were all very varied in terms of genre as well, so it was just a very varied month. We'll see how this goes. The first book I finished in the month of November was The Mysterious Affair at Styles by Agatha Christie. This is the first Poirot book. I believe this is when Poirot was first introduced. He may have been introduced in a short story. I'm not saying it and I'm not sure if it's actually true. I have read a bunch of Agatha's short stories. I've seen The Mousetrap and I have read And Then There Were None. I've seen all of the newer Poirot adaptations with Kenneth, I've forgotten his last name, it begins with a B. So I'm familiar with Christie's work, I'm familiar with Poirot, but this is the first full-length novel of Poirot that I've read. And I think Poirot is probably going to be my favourite of Christie's detectives. I've been introduced, I think, to all of them, Marple, Tommy and Tuppence, and there's another guy. Christie's a writer that I definitely want to read more of, and because I've always loved Poirot the most in the past, I thought that's a good place to start. I know you don't technically have to read them in order, but if I want to read them all anyway, it just makes sense to read them in order, I think. So this is where I started, is in this gorgeous HarperCollins hardback edition. I think they're reprinting all of Christie's work in this edition. The problem is they're doing it really randomly, they're not doing it in order. Book number 2, Poirot's second book, isn't in this edition. But I think book 3 is. There's one random Marple one. I think the rest are either Poirot or they're independent. It's just very frustrating because what if they end up not printing them all and then I have a mishmashed set? But they're so beautiful that it's worth taking the risk, I think. I found this to be really readable, as I do with all of Christie's work. I just flew through it. It was so addicting. I didn't love And Then There Were None. It was okay. But the one thing I will say about it is it was so addicting. This is something Christie seems to have in her work. It's just really easy to read. It's really readable. It's this really quaint writing style where it's set in the 20s. And it very much exudes kind of a coziness to it because of that. Poirot is just fascinating and hilarious. I love him. The mystery itself wasn't groundbreaking. It wasn't the craziest mystery I've ever read. But it did get me. There were red herrings and I thought I knew what was going on. I really thought I did. And I didn't. All in all, I very much enjoyed it. Oh, it has these diagrams in it as well. I'm very much excited to keep reading Poirot's work. I'm really excited to keep continuing on with Poirot. I had a lot of fun with this one. It was either a 7 or an 8 out of 10. We'll say a 7.5. Can you see this stack of books down there? Oh, you can. Just ignore that. Next up is the novella, and that is Small Things Like These by Claire Keegan, my first Claire Keegan book. I know she's got a lot of hype over the last few years. This one in particular, it was recently adapted into a film, which I've yet to watch, but I want to watch it so badly. A very small book, incredibly understated, much more so than I was expecting. I was expecting it to be small and quaint. I wasn't expecting it to be as understated as it was. We're in the 80s, we're following Bill Furlong. He's a Colin timber merchant. It's Christmas time and it does kind of have that cozy Christmas charm to it to a point. He basically just is reminiscing on his past. He's got a little bit of an unusual upbringing and just starting to question some things about how the town is run and the amount of value they give to religion. But it's so subtle and there is a plot, things do happen. But there's also just big swaths of time where it's just him chilling with his family. He's not overtly dissecting this stuff as much. It's all just in the subtext of what's going on. You're just questioning it for yourselves, which I think is really cleverly done. I think it's very well written. Again, very readable, very smooth. The writing style didn't necessarily it wasn't, again, groundbreaking or anything, but it was clever in the way that all of these themes and these questions are very much the reader asking them. And they're impossible to ignore, but none of it is overtly discussed. So I really like that element to it. It does remind me of The Wonder by Emma Donoghue. I think if you like one, you'll probably like the other. I loved The Wonder. I think I prefer it between the two. It was so understated that I was a little bit underwhelmed. I think something that has happened within the last few years, and that's never really happened for me. The hype has never really gotten to me that much, but recently, these really hyped books, and I think it's because I go into them expecting them to wow me because so many people rave, and I go into them expecting to be impressed, and I am impressed, but it's like, now that you know it's so good, does it impact you? Like, I feel like these books, part of the reason they're so good is because they're unexpected. I don't really have much more to say. It was well done. It just didn't knock my socks off. I think I'd give that an 8 out of 10. Next is one of the non-fictions. Both of the non-fiction I read this month. Like, I'm kind of hesitant to say that I fully read them this month, but I'm counting them. That is Red, A Natural History of the Redhead by Jackie Collis Harvey. I randomly saw this in Waterstones one day and it like ensnared my attention. In part because I'm writing a novel and one of our lead characters has ginger hair, and so like that's a really big part of her personality, so I thought this was really interesting. But I love like pre-Raphaelite imagery. This one's from Rossetti. I was really interested. I couldn't stop thinking about it. I had to buy it. I knew if I didn't buy it that day I'd regret it. I started this over a year ago. I started this summer of last year. I started it while I was on a trip, and reading it while I was on a trip was really easy. I managed to get like halfway through because I was just like doing like little bit by little bit, like a little bit before bed, like a little bit in the car, a little bit here and there. And then when I got home, reading it became much more difficult, where I was just sitting down for long periods of time trying to read it. It's really interesting. It is exactly what it says on the tin. It's a natural history of the Redhead. We go way back to like the beginning of humanity essentially, and like literally the genetics of how we'll have ginger hair and what that means and the differences between people with ginger hair and not. And then like as time goes on, we then start to look at society and how gingerhead people internalize this stuff, and it is really interesting. There's a lot of interesting information in here. It's just dry. It's really dry. It's a really like niche subject, and she goes into a lot of detail, which is great. I really struggled, and because it wasn't an audiobook, I'm so used to audiobooking non-fiction, I think that didn't help. The only other thing I think I have to note is that like towards the end she did start getting really passionate, and she started kind of comparing the abuse and the bullying of ginger-haired people to some much bigger things, but then she did leave it on a nice note that kind of softened it a little. I don't know how I feel about that per se. Like, it does make sense. I think what she's saying is valid. I just don't know if it's quite comparable to some of the things she was comparing it to. I think that negates a lot of the privilege that ginger people do inherently still have, and it disregards the scope of intersectionality that is at play there. I think on the whole I'd give it a 6 out of 10. I really loved it in theory. I did think it was really interesting. I can see myself rereading bits of it in the future. It was just really dry and really difficult to read. Like, it took me over a year to finish. I was determined to finish it by the end of this year. Next up we have the first poetry collection, and that is Bless the Daughter, raised by the Voice in Her Head by Warson Shire. I bought this one on a whim. I think I heard Jack Edwards recommend it in one of his videos, and I saw it in Waterstones, and I've been trying to read more poetry this year, so I thought, why the hell not? Gorgeous cover. Obsessed with the cover. I know that the poet, she worked on like Beyonce's Lemonade, is it Black is King? I can't remember. This was a really different perspective. It talks about just like what it's like to be raised in her family in general. And it was really interesting. It was really well written. I read this in 2 parts, so I'm struggling to remember the beginning of it. I'm glad that I read it. I'm glad it was outside of, not necessarily my comfort zone, but it was new to me. It was something I hadn't read before. And I'm glad that I now have this perspective in my life, in my brain. Again, it's just one of those things where it just didn't like leave a particular impact on me. I could see myself like forgetting it a little bit. That's literally just down to personal taste. It's got nothing to do with the quality or anything of this collection itself. I personally would give it a 7 out of 10. I would recommend picking it up though. Oh my goodness, I lied at the beginning. I read 4 graphic novels this month, and those are the first 4 volumes of Monstress by Marjorie Liu and Sana Takeda. So we have volume 1, Awakening, volume 2, The Blood, 3, Haven, and 4, The Chosen. These were all rereads. I've read all of these probably many years ago by now. I want to say I read the first one 2019, 2020. This is a high fantasy graphic novel series set in an alternate world of Art Deco beauty and steampunk horror. Monstress tells this epic story of Micah Halfwolf, a teenage survivor of a cataclysmic war between humans and their hated enemies, the Arcanics. There's a lot of different kind of like breeds of people in this. We have ancients, and they're like animal people, and then they got with humans to create Arcanics, and then humans hate the Arcanics and the Ancients, and then humans also have like witches on their side. And there's also like these dead old gods floating around that if they were alive would cause a lot of trouble. This cataclysmic event that I just said ties in with the lore of these gods, and there's a lot of history and backstory, reading from like a lot of different perspectives, and all those perspectives have different pieces of the puzzle, and they all have different allegiances. The amount of different loyalties in this is the thing that stresses me out the most, but it makes it so interesting because you never know who's fully on whose side. I mean, there's some people you can pretty much suspect, but even then it's very stressful. It's a very stressful situation. It's gorgeously illustrated. The writing style is the thing that like drew me to it in the first place. Look at that. I love the illustrations in this. I think are some of my favourite illustrations. I coveted it as my favourite graphic novel series for a really long time. I put this series down at 5, like I just didn't pick up anymore, so I'm like rereading them and I'm going to catch up. There's 9 out currently. Since then I have reread the entirety of Saga, and I kind of think I like Saga better. They're very similar in terms of like their premise, like this war going on. This one is much more complicated than Saga. It's much richer. I do think I prefer the illustration just because this light is so gorgeous, but I love the illustration Saga as well. I think Saga's more readable, it's funnier, although this really took me by surprise. The first one especially is really funny. I don't remember it being so funny. But then I've read so much more of Saga than I've read of Monstress, so by the time I caught up with Monstress, that opinion could be different. Like I'm comparing like this bigger character growth and story development in Saga to this like 4 volumes of Monstress I can remember. I've also read 5, like I said, I just haven't reread that one yet. So I mean, to TBD, it's my second favourite graphic novel series, definitely. We'll see, who knows. I think they all get at least an 8 out of 10. I might give the first one a 9, because I do think it's a really solid first. It's the longest one. We really sink our teeth in. Maybe an 8.5 or 9, yeah. Next up is The Ashes and the Sorceress King by Carissa Broadbent, book 2 in the Crowns of Nyaxia series. I read the first book earlier this year. I'll link to the video where I discuss it down below. This is much bigger than I expected it to be for a start. It's way bigger than the first one. And I by no means think it was like slow or anything, but I do wonder if that's to the detriment of this book. So this is a world in which we follow vampires. There are 2 different kinds of vampires, but they all come from different factions. There's like the House of Night, the House of Shadow, the House of Blood. I remember them all. And I think these 2 different types of vampires are only within the House of Night. Like I thought it was just like a general thing. These 2 factions, these 2 different kind of types of vampires. One have feather wings and one have leather wings. They're at war against each other. I don't fully know why. I clearly didn't understand this part of the plot very well. Araya is a human. She was raised by a vampire king. She enters these trials, and the winner of the trials gets a wish from one of the gods of their world, the vampire god of their world. Fun times ensue. The first one was really fun because we had that trials dynamic. There was always action, like kind of clocked in. You were never too far away from stuff happening, and then it was just interspersed with like character development stuff, and I think it was just structured really well and paced out really well. This one's much slower, much less happens. It is like more about the politics, but I think the character dynamics, funnily enough, are actually pushed way more to the front in this one. We're dealing with the fallout of all the stuff that happened at the end of the first book. I don't know, it's a weird one because I was never bored. I was never like, this is going too slowly. I don't care about what's happening. I was thoroughly entertained the entire time. I was obsessed. But like if I take a step back and I think about it from like a technical standpoint, I don't think it's as strong as the first book. I feel like I know the rumblings of the trajectory that's gonna happen. I hope I do. Really hope it's something much bigger that connects all of these books, because the way the series is laid out is it's going to be 3 duologies all within the same series. I think like we're bouncing between like connected characters, so one of the perspectives in the next book is one of our kind of core characters within these books, but it's like different stories. Hopefully they all interconnect and there's like something bigger at play. I don't have much more to say. It's difficult to rate because I feel like it's like the opposite of Red, A Natural History, where that one I thought was really well done, and like indeed small things like these, they're really well done technically. I can't really fault them. And indeed, blessed is the daughter raised by the voice in her head. they're all well done. I just didn't like reap that much joy from them, whereas this one's the complete opposite. I had so much fun. I'm really enjoying this series, but I do appreciate that it's not the strong. That being said, I don't think it's like poorly written. I don't think it was really badly structured. There was a lot of elements in here that I thought were really strong. I think the complicated emotions were explored really delicately. I'm gonna give it a 7 out of 10, which is what I gave the first one. They're very difficult to compare. They feel very different to one another. Next up, we have the second non-fiction, which is Women Who Run with the Wolves by Clarissa Pinkola Estes, in this gorgeous 30th anniversary edition, which is just truly so pretty. Look at it. This, it's labelled as transformation and liberation psychology. It's definitely like within the self-help category, but it's a really difficult one in terms of genre because it does so many things, and I kind of feel like this might have been part of my problem with it. Our lead the author is a psychologist, so she knows what she's talking about in terms of that. So she is talking about like how our minds work, though she does it through the lens of different like folk stories from a bunch of different communities around the world. So she'll take a folk story and then she'll analyze it and say how we can teach ourselves about wild woman being an archetype, and the wild woman lives within all women, and how she's kind of been squashed over time, but we can see her within the different motifs and aspects of these folk stories and what that can teach us. So it's combining a lot of different stuff together. She very much believes in like the power of stories and the power of stories to teach stuff, and I'm all for that. I love that. Very interested in folk stories. Like at a point I was like, this feels a lot like Women of Myth, which literally just takes a bunch of different women from a bunch of different myths and briefly summarizes them. I think if you like this, you might also like that book. It might be worth checking out. I love the idea of this. It is, I think at times I struggled with like, is this a literary criticism or is this like a self-improvement mindfulness? But like sometimes the balance didn't feel quite right. Sometimes the stuff she was drawing from stories, I drew different things, and she wasn't really kind of open to different interpretations in that way. Like stories aren't set in stone. Like everything she says in here is one interpretation of these stories. Like it's not the default. And I understand that she's read from a lot of stories. She has a very informed opinion. That's just how stories be. Like just because you know more about stories in general doesn't mean you can like completely cast aside other interpretations. I'm a literature graduate, literature and creative writing, so I enjoyed all of that analysis stuff a lot. I think if you didn't come from that lens, you would find it even more tedious. And the biggest problem with this book is it's so incredibly overwritten. It could literally be half the size that it is. It's overwritten structurally. She repeats herself over the course of chapters, and she explains things in a more like roundabout way than she needs to. It could be like condensed so much more, and I think it would be so much more powerful it was. But then also on a sentence by sentence level, it's very flowery, the writing. It's very heavily her tone of voice, which I enjoyed. But the way she just says things, it's almost like she goes out of her way to use more words than she needs to. And I lost patience. I had to skim a big chunk of this book because I just couldn't do it. Which is really frustrating because I really wanted to love this. In theory, I would love this. So I'm gonna give it a 5 out of 10, which feels really low. I think there are some valuable lessons being heard. There are some brilliant lines in here. It's a great idea. She's obviously a very knowledgeable woman. I just couldn't do it. It was just painful. I don't know that I could recommend this torture onto anyone. Next up, we have the short story collection, and that is The River of Silver by Shannon Chakraborty. This accompanies the David Bad trilogy, which I read earlier this year. I will link the videos where I discuss the books down below. I enjoyed the David Bad trilogy. It's not like a new favourite or anything. I was pleasantly surprised by that. I really loved the world, and I really loved the characters. Very much more of like a political fantasy than like an adventure fantasy. And I think it's really clever. I think it's really interesting. And the characters just really stuck with me. That was by far my favourite thing about reading this one. This is like tales from the David Bad trilogy. Kind of like excerpts. Like deleted scenes almost is what it felt like. In the author's note, Shannon talks about how she, during COVID, was really struggling to write, found herself returning to some of these tales. She basically wrote like a lot of backstory while writing the David Bad trilogy, and it was stuff that she needed to know, and it's stuff that like might be mentioned here or there in the trilogy, but like ultimately didn't end up having a place within the trilogy. So they don't necessarily feel like full structured stories, they're very much like excerpts. That being said, like I thought I was going to find it frustrating in the beginning, I did end up really enjoying this. Like I said, I love the world and I love the characters. The stories with Jumpshade and Mutadere in particular were my favourites. I love them. What can I say? And I really, we don't get to see a lot of their relationship in the trilogy at all. So it was really nice getting to explore it a little bit in here. There are a couple of stories that take place like after the events of the full trilogy, and that was really nice to know. Like have a direction for some of our characters and know that like they're gonna be okay. I really want to check in with these characters again. I kind of really hope they come up in the adventures of Amina al-Sarafi somehow, some way. I just find them so funny, and I think getting to read them in an adult context rather than a young adult context, because there's a lot of swearing in these books and they're very much on the verge. Like our characters are in their mid-20s at the youngest, so it really did feel like it was on the verge of adult in a lot of ideas and themes, and it's just the way it was written made it YA. So I think it'd be really fun to just explore, and I just want to know what happens to them. I love spending time with them. Yeah, that's it. Those are my thoughts. I would give this one a 7 out of 10. I'm really glad I read it, actually. I do think if you really like the trilogy, it adds something to it. Next, we have the second poetry collection, which is Anne-thology. Poems representing Anne Shakespeare. This is collected by a bunch of different authors. I think there's 4 editors as well. In the preface, the introduction, they talk about like why they wanted to do this, how there's so much talk about Shakespeare and Anne kind of gets left on the side, and even then there's a very kind of rigid interpretation of her. Like we all think about the second best bed and the fact that she came from a cottage, and I guess the narrative of her has come across as quite two-dimensional. And so they just wanted to explore all these different aspects of her life from all these different perspectives, and I loved that idea. Big array of different poets in here, and some of them I think were even children from a primary school, which is really cute. There are a lot of poems in here that I really loved. It's in the middle of a stack, like quite at the bottom of a stack actually, which is why I can't show it to you, but there's a lot of tabs in my copy. There's some of them that like actually make me tear up. I loved them so much. Anne is a person that I think about a lot. Ever since I read Hamlet earlier this year, I find her fascinating. I've not read that much non-fiction about her. I think I should, because I clearly am interested in her. Because this collection has such a variety of authors and poets, there are very different styles, very different themes, which I loved, but they're not all going to be to everyone's taste, naturally, which is fine. It doesn't have to be. But that's just to see that there were some in here that I really, really loved, and there were some in here that, like, I really didn't have much opinion on at all. Overall, I'm going to give it 7 out of 10 because I love the idea behind this, and the ones that I loved, I did really love. The last book I finished this month, and arguably maybe the most important, so please, for the love of God, no more camera hijinks for the rest of this video, please. And that is Intermezzo by Sally Rooney, the long coveted return of, I say long coveted, I think she publishes a book like every 2 to 3 years, so we can't really complain. I did have the fear of like not reading it while there was still like hype and attention on it. Books Unbound, actually this is something they've discussed a lot, how Ariel wants to read this while it's still hyped, and there's been a whole debate about what term should we like come to term these books with, and I definitely felt that as well, and I definitely wanted to read it within the year. I have a thing about like reading new releases within the year they come out, because otherwise I feel like I never, like the excitement just dies down and I don't actually get to them. And also just to like manage the TBR situation I have going on. But now that I've read it, I'm really sad that like I have to wait for her to publish something else. To be fair, there's a short story in the back of this one, so I think I might wait and give it a while until like I'm having like withdrawal. I mean, I'm assuming you all know who Sally Rooney is. She's very Marmite author. People either love her or they hate her. I think there are some people that kind of like, yeah. I love her. Her writing is really interesting because she breaks so many rules of grammar and punctuation. A lot of her sentences, like, they're just structured incorrectly. Basically, they're really fractured, which I love. I think I have, like, a thing against it because it was beaten into us at university that you cannot do that. You have to follow the rules. And it's not to say that, like, they did say, like, there are a lot of authors who do purposefully break these rules, and when you break them purposefully, it's kind of different. Like, there has to be a reason why you do it, and you have to be consistent with it, and you have to be in control. You have to know that you have to know the rules in order to break them, basically. So they were very insistent that we should learn the rules first before we start breaking them. Very in control of her writing. It's very smooth, clear, very readable, very interesting description. It's not it's not that it's not descriptive. There can be some really beautiful descriptions. And it's not that a lot of emotions are just stated, so it kind of feels a lot of time that it's telling rather than showing end of things. But then the psychology of her characters are so fascinating, and all of that is in the subtext. There's so much that you can imagine what's going on in the characters' heads, but it's all just like you inferring from what's in the book. And that's with all of them. They all kind of have similar-ish themes. They all look at love, they all look at mental health, but the people in them is really what makes them for me. That's like, now that I finished it, I miss being with these characters so much. It feels like a limb has been cut from me. Like, in my head, I've just been living here ever since I finished it. This one feels slightly different from the rest in that we really deal with grief in the beginning. It's a lot more subtle. I was kind of like, I thought this was supposed to be about grief, but it builds as the book goes on. We're following two brothers. Actually, though, we follow three perspectives. We follow Ivan and Peter. Peter is the elder brother, Ivan is the younger brother. They've both recently lost their father. They're not the closest. They're in very different life stages. There are 10 years between them, and they're in very different romantic points in their life. Ivan meets someone at the beginning of this novel, and there's an age gap between them, and so they're kind of trying to navigate that. And then Peter has been entangled with two different women in various ways. There's Sylvia, who he's known since he began college. He's known forever. They're best friends. They used to be together, but then something happened and now they're not. And then he's got his newer girlfriend, who again is much younger than him, Naomi, and they have a very interesting relationship and dynamic as well. They're all of the relationships and dynamics are really interesting. But we also read from Margaret's perspective at times, less so than the brothers, but she is in there. Sections were the ones where I underlined the most, I think. And we're just following them for a little bit of their lives. Her writing feels so grounded and tangible. You can imagine these people as real people completely. You can relate to them on such a human level. Like, there's no grandioseness, there's no like fantastical, it doesn't feel like fiction. And I know that like that is, I think, a marker to me of literary fiction, because they're so like aimless and plotless. Like, they do kind of need to have that real life feeling to them. But hers, just particularly hers and Hazel Hayes' books, there's just something about them that hasn't been replicated by any other author to me. So needless to say, I really liked this one. It felt quite different in terms of the writing style to some of her others. Certainly Peter's perspective felt very, very distinct from the others. It was much more like I said, all of her sentences are quite fractured. His are very, very fractured, very list-like, and it's very much replicating, I think, his mental perspective and where he's at. And I think that's done really, really well. I think that's slightly different to the others. I don't think I've noticed like such a big difference in the way different characters are written in the other ones. I think on my scale, Beautiful World, Where Are You, then Intermezzo, and then Normal People and Conversations with Friends, because you can't make me choose between my children. I really, really love this one as well. It's really frustrating because I can't quite articulate why. I find this with all of her books, but especially this one, I just loved it. It's as simple as that. I'm gonna give it, is it a 9 or a 9.5 or a 10 out of 10? It's up there. I really love this. I can't really fault it. I'm going to give it a 9.5 out of 10. I don't know that it's a 10 out of 10. I think it's too soon to claim that, because like I reserve my 10s out of 10. I give them sparingly. But 9 feels too low, so I'm going to give it a 9.5 out of 10. I really loved Intermezzo. If you're a Sally Rooney fan, I think you're going to love it. It is longer than a lot of her other books as well, and I do wonder, like I've heard some criticisms about that, and I think shorter books often well respected because it's harder to write a short book with such control, and especially her first two books were really concise and punchy. So I think there's merit to that, but at the same time, it didn't drag for me. I didn't notice it being slower. I think the plot felt looser. I think Beautiful World, Where Are You and Intermezzo both have a looser plots. They both feel much more mundane in that we're just following these people's lives, whereas Conversations with Friends and Normal People has a little bit more drama to them. And those were all the books that I read in November. I'd love to hear what you read in November. If you've read any of these books and you have any opinions, please, please, please let me know them in the comments. I'd love to discuss. And that is all I have for this video. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you have a wonderful morning, afternoon, evening / night. Mine is Jade. I hope I see you again next time. Goodbye!